hasn't come back yet. But something tells you he's in the works. You couldn't exactly explain why. It's not a concrete sign you could show someone else. It's something more diffuse. A slight shift in the texture of the silence between you. Something imperceptibly different in the way the absence has been lately. As if something had begun to move on the other side, in a space you can't see but can feel, in a way you can't quite rationalize. And you wonder what's really going on in there. Not in his messages or his visible actions, in his head. In that inner space where something is working, where something is evaluating, where something is perhaps hesitating between several directions whose outcome you don't yet know. Perhaps there was a separation, a distance, something closed between you in a way that didn't seem entirely final even at the time. Perhaps you've had exchanges since then, neutral, cautious, saying little but also not saying that it was truly over. And in this ambiguous space, you carry a question you don't ask aloud to anyone. What is he really thinking right now? Tonight, I'm going to show you what really goes on in a man's psyche in the period leading up to a return. Not his conscious thoughts, you can't know those, but the unconscious processes that activate within him, that organize his behavior without him fully realizing it, and that often end up producing a movement in your direction even before he's consciously decided to come back. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human soul the world has ever known, devoted decades to understanding how the male unconscious deals with deep connections, and in particular, what happens in a man's psyche when something important to his development has been left unresolved. And the concept he developed to explain this phenomenon is called the anima, this inner feminine figure that lives in the psyche of every man, and which, when it recognizes itself in a real woman, does not simply allow itself to be erased by a decision to leave. It continues to work, to rise again, to produce an orientation toward what it had recognized. In a nutshell, the anima is the part of the male psyche that cannot forget what it has truly recognized. And this part works alone, in the dark, long before words come. What's happening in his head right now isn't solely conscious. And understanding the unconscious layers of this process completely changes how you interpret it. Jung observed something fundamental about how the male psyche deals with separation with a deep connection. He observed that a man can make a conscious decision to walk away, for reasons that may be logical, circumstantial, even sincere, but that this conscious decision does not end the work his unconscious continues to do on what has been left behind. This unconscious work is silent. It takes place beneath the surface of his daily life, in his dreams, in his involuntary associations, in that slight dissatisfaction that arises when he tries to replace something that was of a particular nature with something ordinary. And here is the precise mechanism of what happens. When a man has met a woman who has activated his anima, that inner image of what he seeks to complete within himself, and he has distanced himself from her for reasons related to his persona, his fear, his conscious circumstances, the anima does not leave with him. It remains, active, searching. And this anima, in the period preceding a possible return, goes through a precise process that few people have ever described clearly. She initially seeks fulfillment elsewhere. He meets other people, immerses himself in work or activities, tries to reconfigure his life without the space you occupied. And each attempt produces something revealing, not the expected satisfaction, but a slight inadequacy. Something missing, something that doesn't quite fit, that vaguely resembles what he seeks but isn't quite, not in the same way. It is this inadequacy that begins to speak, and somewhere deep down, you already knew it. Not as a certainty you readily grant yourself, because you've learned to distrust that kind of perception, to ask yourself if you're telling yourself what you want to hear. But something inside you knew that the silence between you wasn't a dead silence. It was an active silence, a silence in which something was working, and that silent activity was real, even if it was invisible. Herein lies the paradox at the heart of what is happening in his psyche right now. And it is a paradox that Jung documented with an accuracy that applies to almost every man in this situation. The man who thinks he has forgotten you thinks of you more than the one who says he cannot forget you. Just one sentence. And she explains why her silence isn't what it seems. Jung would explain this paradox in this way. The person who verbalizes their attachment, who speaks of what they feel, who actively seeks to maintain contact, has a channel of expression for what they carry within them. The feeling circulates. It finds form in words, in gestures, in communication. But the man who remains silent, who leaves resolutely, who constructs a facade of detachment, who spends weeks or months without making contact, this man has not suppressed what he feels. He has buried it in the unconscious, and what is buried in the unconscious does not disappear. It intensifies, it concentrates, it seeks its way out, and the way out he always ends up finding is a re-emergence, towards the surface, towards consciousness, towards behavior. This is what Jung called enantiodromia, the law by which what is pushed too far in one direction eventually turns back towards its opposite. A man who has distanced himself with too much resolve, who has maintained a distance with too much effort, who has constructed a silence with too much determination, this man prepares, in that very determination, the ground for his own reversal. It's not a guarantee. It's a dynamic. And understanding this dynamic changes the way you interpret what's happening on the other side of the silence. This preparatory process goes through several phases that you can begin to recognize. The first phase is what I call defensive rationalization. This is the phase in which he tells himself things, to himself, perhaps to others, that justify the distance. Logical explanations as to why it was better this way. Reasons articulated around incompatibility, bad timing, difficult circumstances. These explanations may be partially true. It's not that he's lying. It's that his persona, that structure of control and mastery that is often central to male psychology, needs to provide a rational framework for something that, at a deeper level, was not entirely a rational decision. In this phase, he actively works to convince himself that the distance is correct. This active work, this energy put into persuading himself, is already, in itself, a sign that something resists persuasion. The second phase is what I call involuntary comparison. This is the phase that follows, often a few weeks or months after the departure. He goes through his life without you, and specific moments produce a resonance that wasn't planned. He hears something that reminds him of your way of thinking. He's in a situation that would have produced something different if you had been there. He meets someone, and something in the conversation tells him, without him even looking for it, that it's not the same. That something in the quality of the exchange, in the accessible depth, in the way he can or cannot be himself, something is not what he experienced with you. These comparisons are not sought after. They happen, and each one leaves something in his psyche. Information about what is missing, about what had particular value, about what distance has removed rather than resolved. The third phase is what I call the nocturnal resurgence. This is the deepest and least controllable phase. In the spaces where the persona relaxes, in dreams, in half-sleeps, in moments of fatigue when conscious defenses lower, what had been contained begins to rise again. You appear in his thoughts at specific moments when he had no intention of thinking about you, in a quality of presence that is not ordinary nostalgia. Something more immediate, more charged, less like a memory, and more like an open question. These moments are a sign that the anima is working, that it has not accepted the erasure that the persona had demanded, and that it is actively seeking an expression, a resolution, a way to manifest itself in its conscious life. The The fourth phase is what I call the movement towards the exit. This is the most concrete phase, the one that directly precedes any action, any contact, any kind of response. Something in their daily life creates an opportunity, a plausible excuse to contact you, a circumstance that justifies breaking the silence, a moment when something says the window is open. And he does something, not always something grand, sometimes very small, a neutral message, a reaction to something you say in a shared space, an indirect way of signaling that he's been thinking about you. The size of the gesture isn't proportional to what preceded it internally. The size of the gesture is proportional to what his persona can still allow itself at this stage. But here is what Jung would now add, and this is the most important part of tonight, the part that directly concerns you. Everything I've described to you is happening inside him. And now the question isn't what's going on in his head. The question is what you truly want, and whether you're even aware of it. Because Jung would ask you that question directly. During all that time you were waiting, reading the signs, wondering what was happening on the other side of the silence. What have you been doing with your own life? Have you continued to grow? Have you nurtured what makes you who you are? Have you clarified for yourself what you deserve in a connection? Not what you would accept out of love, but what you need to be truly happy? Because if and when he comes back, in whatever form, you want to be someone who receives that return from a place of clarity, not from a place of waiting, not from a position of dependence on what he decides to do, from a place of self-knowledge, of your own desire, of what you are willing to give and what you need in return. This return, if it happens, can only be transformative, for him as well as for you, if you yourself are different from the person he left. Not superficially, but in the way you carry yourself, in the clarity of what you want, in that quiet certainty about your own worth that doesn't depend on what he chooses. What you perceive from her is real. This movement preparing itself in her psyche, this way something is working even before words arrive. It's not a projection. You were reading something real in the space between you and you. Your way of holding this silence with dignity, of continuing to exist fully without waiting for his permission to do so. This way of being is the most precious thing you can bring to what comes next. Whether he comes back or not, you deserve to be someone who hasn't put their life on hold, waiting for what he decides. And that someone, that version of you, whole, clear, alive in its own existence, is precisely what creates the context in which a real return, if it happens, can be something different from what happened before. Not a cycle that starts again. Something new. Just tell me one thing in the comments. Are you also waiting for someone to come back right now? One word is enough. I read every message. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video tonight with someone who's waiting, someone who needs to know what's really happening on the other side of the silence. Take care of yourself.